uh, nearly nearly 60 days of the 45 folks that are involved in ACIP spent on COVID vaccines this last year. As of December 31st, there were 597 million COVID-19 doses delivered to healthcare providers, and 486 million of those doses were administered. That's incredible. That is an incredible number to go from 1 to 486 million within a single year. There are 202 million people fully vaccinated as of the end of the year, and 55 million have received a booster dose as of December 31st. And not surprisingly, the vast majority of those people who received booster doses are individuals over age 65. As we go down in age, fewer and fewer numbers of people have gotten the booster dose by age. But at any rate, the boosters are happening. Let's talk a little bit about the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. I'm going to cover each of the vaccines. There's a lot of words on some of these slides, but just to give you a little bit of the time frame, it was December of 21 that FDA authorized and CDC recommended that 18-year-olds and above should get a 2-dose series. And then now in 21, along with the single booster dose 6 months after the primary series, or 2 months following a J&J vaccine. In May, that should say December 2020, it was then later in that year. Again, I apologize for the typo there. In May of 21, FDA authorized the COVID vaccine for 16 to 17-year-olds. In December of 21, CDC recommended that age group may receive a booster dose 6 months after the primary series, but it's not required, of course. Then in December of 21, the FDA authorized and the CDC recommended a reduced dose formulation of the Pfizer vaccine for 5 to 11-year-olds as a 2-dose sequence. And then on January the 3rd, just a couple days ago, the CDC decreased the interval for Pfizer vaccine boosters to 5 months following a primary Pfizer vaccine series. And just today, the CDC ACIP recommended that all children 12 to 17 years of age should receive a booster dose. So they changed the may on 16 to 17-year-olds to should, and then dropped the age down to 12 years of age for a should statement. And again, now the interval is 5 months following the primary series with the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. Now, of course, this is pending adoption by the CDC director, who happened to be on today's call, and we're told has already adopted it by this point. So I'm assuming it's probably published by now. Just to kind of give you some context on the safety issue on the boosters, because this is a question you're going to get. In December, when the ACIP voted that 16 to 17-year-olds may receive a booster dose, that was based upon vaccine safety surveillance data, looking carefully at the occurrence of adverse events, and particularly looking at myocarditis risk after the booster dose or after the second doses. And if you look at the European studies that were done with and the Israeli studies in particular, the Israelis have been doing booster doses in children for a fairly significant period of time in adolescence. And there was no observed myocarditis, very little myocarditis seen even after second doses in Israel. Today, the Israelis actually presented at the ACIP meeting, and out of 81,000 doses, booster doses of Pfizer vaccine that's been given in Israel in this age group, they've only had 2 cases of myocarditis after a third booster dose. So the bottom line here is that while there is some small chance of myocarditis, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, the risk of myocarditis appears to go down with the booster dose, that there's less risk. And perhaps that's because over time, 5 months or so, the antibody levels are low enough that you're getting a true boost and not a hyper response. So that's the hope there. The efficacy for the boosters, and there's some more data I'll show later about this, is about 95.3% among adolescents 16 to 17 years of age, but it's also true in the younger children as well. And there were about 4.5 million adolescents that were fully vaccinated with the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine when the booster was approved. And so that's the situation that we ran into with the 16 to 17-year-olds. Now we talk about these, the Pfizer vaccine formulations, and they're changing, as you all are aware. When we started, we had a purple top vaccine that required reconstitution. I don't know how many vials of Pfizer vaccine I've reconstituted in my life, but it's like all of you, hundreds of them, and very temperature sensitive, although we've learned over time that it's more stable than we thought it was. Then came the pediatric vaccine, which is on the far right-hand corner, which is the orange top vaccine. These are the Pfizer products are now being commonly referred to by the color of their top for good reason, to try to minimize errors. The orange top vaccine is the pediatric formulation, not the same formulation as the purple top vaccine, given to 5 to 11 year of age. It does require reconstitution, as you know, but about a third of the amount of antigen for pediatrics. I'll just mention as a side note here to you all that the vaccine adverse event reporting system folks today, VAERS folks from FDA presented, and there have been just under 1,000 dosing errors that have occurred in pediatric patients out of about 8.5 million doses in the US. Thankfully, while there were some localized adverse reactions reported, there were no serious adverse reactions reported in individuals who received an incorrect dosage, meaning that the 1,000 pediatric patients, roughly 1,000 pediatric patients who received the purple top inadvertently vaccine instead of the orange top, while that did represent a dosing error, did not result in any serious adverse events. And so that's good to note. But we do need to be diligent about making sure we're using the right product. As you all are probably aware by now, Pfizer has come out with a new product, a gray top product that's to be used in 12 years of age and older, that requires no dilution. And I don't know how many happy dances to do on that one, but I'm sure that every pharmacist and pharmacy technician in America is dancing because of the gray top. We did learn today that Pfizer will be phasing out over time the purple top vaccine. It won't exist at some point in the near future, and we'll have just a gray top and an orange top that will exist here in the US. And so all of this data, which this chart was provided by Pfizer, is important information and something that you can post on your refrigerators if you need to. So the CDC also announced, FDA announced, and CDC announced this week that children who are 5 to 12 years of age who are immunocompromised should also receive an additional dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech primary series. Now, this is not a real big surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise to any of you, because we knew that immunocompromised adults did not mount as robust of an immune response after 2 doses, and so we had to add a third dose to the primary series with the adult patients. So it was not at all surprising that the FDA and CDC recommended then an additional dose as a 3-dose primary series for immunocompromised children, as well for individuals who have moderate to severe immunocompromising conditions. And the safety data here was good with the kids. No, very, very few cases of myocarditis. In fact, even a lower number of cases of myocarditis in these younger children than there were seen in the 16 to 24-year-olds. I've provided for you all, just for your reference, what the CDC defines as moderately to severe immunocompromised. This is exactly the same definition that's used across the entire population. This is not unique just to the 5 to 11-year-olds. This definition is pretty much across all of the age groups, but I've provided it here just so that you can see which kids are supposed to receive that 3-dose primary immunization series. Again, not considered a booster, it's considered a 3rd dose for primary immunization. And then again, the other big change that happened this week, that's happened first at the FDA and then at the CDC, was the Pfizer-BioNTech booster is now recommended at a 5-month interval. Now, why 5 months? Well, because the Omicron variant is raging right now, and it does appear that individuals with the booster are better protected against symptomatic infection with Omicron than those that don't have a booster. And Israel does have strong data there. Israel actually was using a 5-month interval long before it was even thought about or discussed here. They have seen a significant decline in severe illness and death by using a 5-month interval. And so we're sort of falling in line and in suit with what's being done in Europe and in Israel and in Australia as well. And then again, we've talked about here that there are about 188 million adults in the US who are fully vaccinated with this vaccine, and about 38% have gotten a booster with this vaccine. I'll move on. And also, just to address, we knew early on in the pandemic that uptake among underrepresented minority populations of the vaccine was low, that there was a greater degree of reluctance for getting the vaccine. This is a survey that was done prior to Omicron of parental intent to have their children vaccinated. And that was something that we looked at today, would 12 to 17-year-old children's parents be likely to get their children vaccinated? And what this shows is that about 60% of parents absolutely said that they would do that, and there were another 16% or so of parents who said that they probably would, but they hadn't quite made up their mind yet. And there were about 19% who said they probably would not, or definitely would not, have their child immunized against COVID, no matter what the recommendation was. And when you look at that information based on race and ethnicity, you'll notice that the most accepting population now for childhood immunization against COVID is the Hispanic population. And the most resistant population is actually the Caucasian population. This is largely believed to be because politics has entered into the conversation a lot related to the vaccines. And we think that that's had some influence, at least, on the Caucasian resistance to the vaccine. But there are probably other reasons as well. But those are some of the things that are out there right now. There is a vaccine safety task force that meets regularly, largely made up of people who serve on that same work group that I serve on, although I do not serve on the vaccine safety task force, that looked carefully at the data from U.S. safety monitoring systems. There are 3 that are out there primarily used, and they looked at booster doses and primary vaccination series doses for ages 12 all the way up to 24 years of age. There's no safety signal or concern that's been identified. We know about myocarditis risk and pericarditis risk. That hasn't changed. The incidence of that has not changed over time, despite larger numbers of vaccinations being given. And so at this point, and in fact, there have been no fatalities from myocarditis or pericarditis in kids who have developed that syndrome. And so that's good news as well. all of those cases have resolved, and that's very good news. There's more data on this in the slide set on ACIP's website, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to belabor the point here. This shows the UK's data on boosting, and this is the second. I think the middle column here is the BioNTech vaccine, and the third column is the Moderna vaccine. And so you see the second dose that breakthrough of infections with Omicron, which is in the gray circles. Breakthrough infections occur at a greater rate than they do with the Delta variant. After boosting with the Pfizer vaccine or with the Moderna vaccine, the breakthrough infection rate is much, much lower. So that's one of the reasons why booster doses are being recommended. That's it for Pfizer. There's not a lot new to tell you about the Moderna vaccine. You all know the history that the FDA authorized a 25 microgram booster dose, so about half the amount that was antigen that was provided in the initial dose for anyone who was over 19. In November, CDC also recommended the use of the vaccine just as the FDA had authorized it. On January 6th, sorry, I've got this wrong. January 6th, CDC recommended the use of the booster. It should say a 6-month interval. I've listed that wrong. So here's the story about this, and this was discussed briefly by the FDA today. There is a petition from Moderna to consider reducing the interval for Moderna's vaccine down to 5 months. That has not yet been acted on by the FDA. So for right now, the Moderna vaccine is a 6-month interval, and I apologize for the typo on the slide. And the Pfizer vaccine is a 5-month interval. And I'm sorry to everybody that that means another one of those things we've got to think about when we give the vaccine boosters. You all probably know Moderna has submitted a pediatric emergency use authorization request to the FDA, and action is still pending on that, although the FDA does indicate that they are moving on it, and it won't be much longer, and they will act on the pediatric indications for Moderna. The J&J vaccine has been quite an interesting one. As you know, in February of 2021, FDA authorized it as a single dose for adults. And then on April the 13th, there was a pause in the use of the vaccine because of the occurrence of cerebrovascular stenosis and thrombosis in the presence of thrombocytopenia. So to have a clot occur in the brain, essentially in the base of the brain, the vessels and the large vasculature that leads to the brain, in the presence of thrombocytopenia is quite an unusual circumstance. And there were 8 of those cases that occurred initially in April of 2021. Interestingly enough, and I can talk about this because it was publicly talked about, one of those cases was at our hospital, and it was a transferred in case, and it was quite interesting to follow that case. Thankfully, the individual recovered. But there were some deaths that occurred, and in December, the COVID-19 work group that I sit on was presented with more complete data analysis through August of the occurrence of TTS in the vaccine. And so in December, because of that additional safety data and the definitive nature that it was believed that the vaccine has in fact caused death in at least a handful of individuals who developed TTS, and because there is superior efficacy of the mRNA vaccine, you're talking about 95% efficacy versus 70% efficacy roughly. And because we have abundant supply of mRNA vaccine, it just made sense for the CDC ACIP to make a preferential recommendation that mRNA vaccine should be used. Now, the J&J vaccine was not removed from the market. And that's a big question that people ask. Well, why didn't they just take it off the market? Well, that is one of the options they could have considered, but we're still in a pandemic. And when safety is balanced, that there is potentially is still a role for the vaccine to play in some patients. So I gave you this, the data through August 31st, which is this new data that just came out in December. There were 54 cases of TTS identified out of 3.83 million. That comes to a rate of 3.83 per 1 million Janssen doses that were given. Females have the highest rate of TTS, and mostly women who are between 30 and 49 years of age. There had been, at the time that we reviewed the data, 9 deaths following vaccination. So that was a rate of 0.57 per million. And again, all of those deaths occurred in women who were 30 to 49 years of age. So this, the reason, what I'm put up here is actually some data on a similar vaccine. As you'll recall, the Janssen vaccine is a different type of vaccine. It's an adenovirus vector vaccine. AstraZeneca also produces a vaccine through a similar mechanism, adenovirus vector vaccine, but does not market that vaccine in the US. And the European Union saw cases of TTS occur as well with the AstraZeneca vaccine. So we think that this is a class effect with the adenovirus vector vaccines. And so as a result of that, most of those cases occurring after the first vaccine dose, the UK uses the AZ vaccine in a 2-dose sequence. Important to know. So we looked carefully at what other countries have done with the AstraZeneca vaccine. There were 16 countries at the time that had recommended use of AstraZeneca's vaccine. After TTS was identified, 5 of them stopped using the vaccine altogether. 7 used the vaccine, but preferentially recommend other COVID vaccines, primarily the mRNA vaccines. 2 don't have a preferential recommendation, but they use that age range of 55 or older or 60 or older as the recommended group for the adenovirus vaccines. And 2 had no restrictions. And then there were 12 on the Janssen vaccine in the world. 3 countries halted the use of the Janssen vaccine. 4 still use it, but have preferential recommendation. 1 doesn't have a preferential recommendation, but only uses it in older people. And then 4 recommend the vaccine in all. Again, we, the US, took the approach of having a preferential recommendation. So still making the vaccine available on the US market, but preferentially for both primary immunization and booster, just recommending that. So again, if you look at the efficacy against hospitalization, the mRNA vaccines are superior. There's just no 2 ways about it. The data are very clear that an mRNA vaccine is much more efficacious at preventing severe illness. And that's just really important. And so that's where we came from. So let's talk about the clinical considerations real briefly. I will tell you that MMWR, there will be an MMWR release tomorrow or Friday that will update the clinical considerations. They'll also be put on the website, but there have been a lot of clinical changes. There have been clinical guidance for the booster doses in 16 to 17-year-olds in December, the preferential recommendation around Janssen vaccine in December, the new formulation of the Pfizer vaccine, and then the immunocompromised 5 to 11-year-olds, the decrease in the booster interval down to 5 months, and then, of course, based on today's guidance, a new recommendation for we should be giving 5 to 17-year-olds a booster dose now. So that's a lot of recommendations. There's a timeline here that's nice and handy for you, so you can kind of see how those changes have all transpired. Another thing, I put this table in here just to kind of help you have some resources. I've presented it 2 or 3 different ways in here so you can see the data in different ways. Pfizer vaccine has changed down to 12 years of age for booster doses at a 5-month interval. Moderna is 18 and older at a 6-month interval, and the Janssen vaccine is at or older than age 18, and it's a 2-month interval following Janssen vaccine for a booster dose there. And as you all know, there is what's called heterologous boosting, which means that doesn't matter which vaccine you got for your primary series, you can receive any vaccine that's available for your booster dose with a preference to receive an mRNA vaccine. If you had Janssen as your primary series, it's preferential that you receive an mRNA vaccine as your booster dose as it stands now. So that's where we are with that. And then I used a little of my fancy pen work here to show that now we have a change as of just hours ago that 12 to 17-year-olds should receive a booster 5 months after receipt of a primary series. So this was their beautiful table, and they messed it up with their vote today. And I guess the good news here is it simplifies that everybody over age 12 should get a booster. And then for 5 to 11-year-olds, it's just those who are immunocompromised. All right, now let's get back to those questions. Which of the following population subset is not routinely recommended to receive a booster dose of COVID-19 vaccine? Does anybody want to yell it out? Anyone brave enough to say who doesn't get a booster routinely? It's a little tricky. It's B. Individuals, not all individuals 5 to 11 need to get a booster. Right now, it's only recommended as a booster dose in 5 to 11 if you are immunocompromised. All those other groups there are recommended to get a booster dose as of today. All right, which of the following is the appropriate vaccine formulation to administer a booster dose to a 25-year-old who's completed Moderna series and no serious adverse reactions? I saw a couple of people say D, and that would be right. The Pfizer gray top at 0.3 mLs would be the correct booster dose. A is incorrect because the Moderna dose as a booster is given at 0.25 mLs. We would not preferentially give J&J vaccine any longer as a booster dose to anyone, unless the only exception is if you had someone who had a serious allergic reaction to an mRNA vaccine, then that is the person who would in fact potentially benefit from getting a J&J vaccine. But in my opinion, I'd even say if that person's over age 50, it would be even better than giving it to someone who's younger. And then the Pfizer orange top, of course, is the pediatric formulation. Normally I hate looking at pictures of myself, but this was my favorite picture that was taken. This was on the first day that we received vaccine at the hospital in December of 2020. And I was really happy that the photographer took this picture. This was the very first vial of vaccine that we received. And actually, this is the diluent that I was drawing up, getting ready to inject the diluent into the very first vial. It's always good to look back and remember where we've come from. We've come an awful long way in a course of a year. And an awful lot of doses have been drawn in the days coming since. So I took just a couple minutes longer than I intended to take to present the information. And I think what I'll do now is just answer as many questions as I can handle in the time that we have remaining. And Jenny, I don't know if you want to moderate the questions or how you want to handle it.
Sure. Thank you so much for that presentation. One of the things that was brought up in the chat by Miranda Wilhelm was if you could talk about some of the correct language and also how we should handle things when people aren't receiving the full dose initially. So they just maybe get one dose of the mRNA and not the two. And then now we're talking about booster doses. So is it really a booster dose if they come back?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You're going to see something happen over the next several weeks in terms of messaging out of the CDC. I have mixed feelings about what's about to come out of the CDC's mouth. They mentioned it for the first time publicly today, so I'm not sharing anything confidential here. They're going to start using the language, are you up to date on your COVID vaccine? Because it is confusing for consumers to know, am I supposed to have 2 doses? Am I supposed to have 3 doses and a booster? Am I supposed to have 2 doses and a booster? It depends if you're immunocompromised, if you're not immunocompromised. It's very confusing for consumers. So what they're going to talk about is, are you up to date on your vaccination sequence? And right now, the correct language would be that for immunocompromised individuals, it's a 3-dose primary series for the mRNA vaccines. For everyone else, it's a 2-dose primary series. And then everyone needs to get a booster dose. Now, the CDC's been vague about the immunocompromised persons. Does that mean they get a 4th dose? Does that mean that they need to get a 4th dose, a booster dose, after their 3-dose primary series? And it was mentioned today that the ACIP is going to take up that discussion and that decision making in the coming weeks. And so there will be clear guidance about that in the very near future. But right now, whether it's a primary series or a booster, right now, 3 doses is the maximum number of doses of a COVID vaccine. But I fully expect for immunocompromised patients, there is going to be a 4th dose. I really do think that's going to happen. The data bears out that the response drops off pretty quickly, and we're seeing a lot of breakthrough infections in immunocompromised patients.
So instead of saying fully vaccinated, we should say up to date.
Up to date. Are you up to date on your vaccination series?
Because there's some meeting policies for people to come to in-person meetings, and we've been saying fully vaccinated, so we should switch that to up to date.
Yeah, up to date is the language that the CDC is going to start changing their language to, instead of saying fully vaccinated. Now, I'll just give you the con side of that, okay? The con side is that for local jurisdictions, and I live in one of them, that likes to mandate everything, okay? Mandating that you be up to date means that you'll have to have a booster. And so for people in Los Angeles County who have to show proof of immunization before they walk into a restaurant, they're going to be frustrated that they've got to have a booster dose to be considered up to date. So there is a negative side to using this up-to-date language, that politically it's going to polarize people. And I suspect that whether you listen to CNN or Fox News, it doesn't matter, you're going to hear this debate now for the next 3 or 4 weeks, because that's going to be the new language coming out of the CDC is up to date. But I'm the messenger. Don't shoot me. I'm just telling you, this is what's coming, and you need to be prepared to, this subtle change in language is going to be about being up to date. So Jenny, I don't know if that answers the question fully, but that's what's happening.
All right. Well, thank you. And another question about boosting. So if a Pfizer series is given first, and then they're given a booster with Moderna, do you wait 5 or 6 months?
So the 5-month interval is based on, so if you had the Pfizer series as your primary series, then it's 5 months before you get a booster. You can get the booster with the Moderna vaccine, or you can get it with the Pfizer vaccine. But the Pfizer vaccine has a 5-month interval before you get the vaccine. The Moderna vaccine, if you got the Moderna as your primary series, it's 6 months before you get a booster. So it's not the type of vaccine that is being given as the booster that makes the decision. It's the type of vaccine you received as your primary series that determines the interval. I'll be very honest with you. I'm hoping that within the next 10 days, the FDA will change the Moderna thing too, but that's not happened yet. So I'm just giving you today's information. But I fully expect that there will be a 5-month interval for both vaccines coming very, very soon. But for this week, it's 5 months for Pfizer primary series, 6 months for Moderna primary series.
What's interesting is many of us just now got our boosters because of the lag time of getting all that out. So, I mean, I got my second Moderna in February, but I couldn't even sign up to get my booster until 3 days before Christmas. Yeah. So the question that came around the other night on another educational program was if is there going to be a fourth? Are we just going to boost every 5 months?
Yeah, I think one of the answers to that question, Starlin, and this is just my opinion on this thing, is there probably is going to have to be at least an annual booster of vaccine, just simply because coronavirus can drift, much like influenza virus can drift. Much more complex virus. Influenza is a simpleton compared to coronavirus, but because we get that drift, we're likely going to have some sort of a booster. And the reason we would have boosters is not to prevent primary infection, but is to prevent hospitalization and death. And that's what we're really trying to prevent with the boosters. So I think, yes, there will be a fourth. Timing of it, when is that going to happen? When's that recommendation going to come about? I don't know yet, but it is going to come. I really believe there will be a fourth. Israel's already doing it, and they're kind of much more aggressive. They have a higher immunization rate in their population. Now, I did get asked a question privately, would I comment on natural immunity versus vaccines? Yeah, that's an interesting thing. CDC has not wanted to opine on this very deeply, which is a curious thing to me, because with every infectious disease that we've ever known, natural infection generally confers better immunity than vaccine. And usually you develop longer term immunity from natural infection than you do from vaccine. So if we use measles as a case study, anyone who was born before 1957 likely had measles or were exposed to measles virus and don't need to have, maybe unless they're in a healthcare environment, would need to have a measles vaccine. And then we also know that once we get 2 doses of measles vaccine, we don't have to have it again, because that particular virus thankfully does not drift. And so that's good. But coronavirus is a different animal. The Israelis do have some data that shows that natural infection does confer good immunity. And while there have been some individuals who have had Omicron infection, who had alpha strain COVID infection also. So in other words, they've had COVID infection twice. There does seem to be better immunity in people who have had infection. So in Israel, you can actually get a green card that you have been immunized if you had natural infection. And so they consider you immunized in Israel if you've had natural infection and you don't have to get the vaccine. The other thing, though, to kind of point out is that the vaccine does elicit an immune response when the antibody titers are high and you're getting T cell differentiation and creating mature B cells. You're getting T cell response that causes B cells to be attracted in large numbers. The larger that T cell response, the better the B cells respond to, and that's one of the great things about a boost. You get these B cells come in and you produce some differentiated B memory cells, and that's what you need. The B memory cells having great differentiation will give you good response. Those neutralizing antibodies, and I know you've heard a lot about neutralizing antibodies, when they're high, tend to neutralize a wide range of variants of COVID. When your body is exposed to COVID and it's been a long time since you've been vaccinated, if the variant that you've been exposed to is not closely enough related to the vaccine variant that you received, it may take your body a while to respond and to produce its own new neutralizing antibodies. So long story short, probably in the short run, having infection's good enough. If you've been infected and the only variant circulating is the one that you were infected with, that's probably as good as being vaccinated. What the problem is that if a new variant starts circulating, you may or may not be protected. And that's what we're seeing now, is that alpha variant infected individuals are now coming back and getting infected with the Omicron variant. Now, the good news is the Omicron variant is much less serious of an illness. It's less likely to cause hospitalization, 7 times less likely to cause death. It's not nearly as problematic as Alpha or Delta were. And Beta, which nobody ever talks about, which didn't really spread, is actually the most lethal of all of them. And it thankfully never really materialized and caused a lot of spread.
Well, as you know, Michael, I had COVID November of 2020 and was sick for 2.5 months. And then, but I enrolled myself in the CDC study and went down to Barnes Jewish and had, gave blood draws and so we checked my T cells at the end of the 60-day cycle. Then I got the first vaccine and had a very high reaction to it because I was still actively making my own antibodies. And then on my second dose in February, I had a less reactive. So they wanted me to wait for a while. They've been following me. I talk to the CDC people every month, but they wanted me to wait on this booster to see. And I went back down and gave blood and I had T cells, but because of this Omicron, that's what they said. They said, well, go get the booster. So what was great, the booster, I had the typical sore arm, but I did not have the reaction I had post-COVID of the 2 Moderna shots. So to me, that meant that just exactly how you described it, as the neutralizing antibodies came up, then that all had that reactivity. And so it was a good thing that I got a boost. So it's,
yeah.
So that's my own personal case history.
Yeah, I think that's the issue. So in the future, when we see less variation or variability in what's circulating, we get to a point where we're endemic. I'm sure these recommendations will all change, but we're not endemic yet. Now, I will say, and I say this with some degree of hopefulness, I don't want everybody to get sick, but with some degree of hopefulness, Omicron is spreading so fast, so rapidly, that we might actually reach endemic much faster than what we thought we would. It might actually happen quicker because we're getting so many people. I mean, I have a COVID positive child right now who was vaccinated with 2 doses, and I didn't get her booster until the 29th of December. And so within the window of time of potential exposure, we think she was potentially at a New Year's Eve party that I'm not supposed to know about. And I think that's probably where she contracted COVID, but I don't know that for sure. My wife and I and my other daughter had gotten our booster shot in early December and have mounted a full immune response, and none of us have tested positive and none of us have had any problems. So the boosters have worked, at least in my household, although I've also quarantined my 22-year-old off into a room that she's prohibited from entering into the rest of the house. So that's personal experience. We all are dealing with it.
So you're no longer an empty nester.
Well, not for this week.
They all come back. They all come back, Michael. They
Not
all
this
come
week.
back.
I was an empty nester for a few months, but not this week. We're not.
All right,
Anything
so
else I can address?
there were two questions left in the chat. One is, have there been any updates on the universal COVID vaccine?
No. It's interesting. Moderna is probably the most aggressive at researching that, and also a universal flu vaccine. And you may also know that Moderna is doing a study now to look at a combo vaccine that is a combination of flu and COVID together. And I believe it's Sanofi is doing a study on an mRNA vaccine that would prevent COVID, flu, and RSV in the same vaccine. So there are lots of innovations coming along and studies that are being done. Most of those things that Moderna is working on are happening in South Africa and Australia. Those studies are happening.
All right. Well, Starlin told Sam, don't worry about not having any side effects with your 3 vaccines you've received so far.
Yeah. So you didn't have any side effects from your booster dose. That's good news. I didn't have any adverse events other than a sore arm from my first and second dose, but my third dose I did, and took advantage of an extra day of sleep.
Yeah, it's the same with me. I mean, my arm hurt like somebody punched me as hard as they could, but that was about it.
Yeah. It really is good to be with you all. I will forever consider myself part of Illinois, even though I've lived away from the state now for just over 30 years. So it's been a while. But I love nothing more than going back to Southern Illinois and spending time on my family farm. And I have a sister and brother-in-law that live in Rochester, Illinois. Is that Saginaw County, I think, or something like that? Did I get it right?
That's up here by us.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
That's east of Springfield.
And the other thing I'll just confess to you is that I'm a lifelong St. Louis Cardinals fan, and that has not changed. So I know that'll not make you Cubs fans very happy, but I follow the Cards. And in fact, every single time the Cardinals come to Southern California to play in either San Diego or Los Angeles, I go to every game. So I don't miss any of them.
All right. Well, we thank you so much for your time and for rushing to get these updates to us after that meeting today. I know
Very
how
honored.
stressful that can be. And most importantly, thank you for your service in representing the profession on CDC's ACIP, and congratulations on your appointment to that group. Yeah.
Appreciate it. Yep. Good to see everybody. Thank you all very much. And I hope you have a good rest of your meeting.
Yeah. Happy New Year, and hope everybody gets well.
Yeah. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael.
So we'll stop the recording because we do have the CE information.